Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 28, Section 2, the Allied Response. And as we go along, you're going to need your packet, but you're also going to need a little bit of extra paper. We've got a item or so that you're going to need to jot down as we go along. So before we get going here, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the war or the battle in the Atlantic, because that's kind of where we left off from when we were talking a little bit about the Battle of Britain or the Blitz. And one of the things that everyone should probably understand is that during the beginning days of World War II, really control of the Atlantic was key to both the Allies and Axis powers. By 1940, the United States was aiding the British with ships and military escorts so that they wouldn't be targeted so often by German U-boats. And even at this rate, many of those German U-boats were still picking off U.S. ships. One of the things that kind of allowed us to do this was this thing called the Lend-Lease program of 1941. And I want to kind of go through what this is, but it basically was a program where the U.S. would supply the British, free France, China, and eventually the Soviet Union with things like food and oil and materials. And that's kind of a catch-all term for things like warships, planes, and weaponry. And the deal was this would all be given free of charge. It was being borrowed, and with the idea that maybe after the war would end, these items would be returned. Some were never returned because they were destroyed during the war, or they were returned and they were in really bad condition. But the whole idea of the Lend-Lease program was to replace something known as cash and carry. And that was a program that kind of was started because of some of the treaties that the United States had signed that was to allow for our neutrality. And if we would be selling things directly to the British, our allies, that might be construed that we are taking a side and participating in the war. So, in number one, before declaring war on Japan, the United States helped the Allies by offering military aid to Great Britain in the forms of ships and military escorts for convoys. In the months before Pearl Harbor, there was an event in one of these convoys known as the sinking of the Reuben James. The Reuben James was a USS destroyer, it was a naval ship, and it was sunk in October of 41. It's the first time that a U.S. ship had actually been sunk by the Germans, and it's amazing that this one act didn't necessarily pull us into the war immediately, but a lot of people say that this is where our first victims of World War II actually began. So one thing that I should mention is as soon as the U.S. does get into the war, as far as U-boats and things like that coming closer to the U.S. coastline, that became a very common occurrence. And many cities along the eastern shoreline and even along the southern shoreline, along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Alabama and so forth, actually made citizens have what we call blackout shades. So when the sun would go down and when you would turn on your electricity or electrical lights, you had to have curtains on your window that would keep the light from the inside of your house from seeping outside, so that the Germans could use that as a guide to find and perhaps maybe target U.S. seaports. All right, moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about what is eventually going to happen in North Africa. In the fall of 1940, if you were kind of looking at that point in time, the British had control of the country of Egypt, and the Italians had control of a country called Libya and a little bit of Tunisia and such. And in the fall of 1940, Italy decided to attack British troops in Egypt. And what ends up happening is really kind of catastrophic for the Italians. I don't think they necessarily thought that the Allies would come back so strong, but the British were able to push Italian troops that were attacking them, obviously out of Egypt, but they also were able to push them pretty much out of Libya and back towards Tunisia. And it was a kind of a situation where the Axis powers were on the verge of collapsing in North Africa. And as a result of that, Adolf Hitler sends Axis troops into North Africa, and they become known as something called the Afrika Korps. The Afrika Korps were troops made of basically the Axis powers, primarily Germans and Italians. So, control of North Africa was important to the British because they had to protect the Suez Canal. This was kind of their big, I guess you could say, supply line to the Middle East so that they could have oil to keep their military moving. And Italian forces based in Libya obviously attacked Egypt, and the British drove those troops back into Libya and threatened to control all of North Africa. Germany then was forced to send troops, known as the Afrika Korps, into North Africa. And basically from the rest of 1941 and 1942, it's going to be a series of volleys being fired between the Germans and the British. But it's 1942 into 1943 that the momentum changes a little bit. In October of 1942, British General Bernard Montgomery meets up with German General Erwin Rommel at a battle called El Alamein, and the British are able to achieve a huge victory, and they, in a way, are able to kind of move the Germans and put them on the run. And in a sense, the British are pushing from basically Egypt, pushing the Afrika Korps basically towards Tunisia. Okay. Our friend, Erwin Rommel, had a nickname. He was known as the Desert Fox because he had times been able to outwit and outcun the British troops. Okay, by the time we get to November of 1942, after our German troops are on the run, the United States is basically ready to start participating in the war in the Atlantic. And we initiate something called Operation Torch. Operation Torch basically was a landing of U.S. Forces into North Africa. Some landed in Algeria, some landed in Morocco, and eventually they were all pushing from the west coast, or the northwestern coast of Africa towards Tunisia in a way to kind of like, put pressure on both sides of the German military. What ends up happening over a period of time is that during Operation Torch, the U.S. troops are able to have a victory over the French Vichy troops, which are the troops that were allied with the Axis powers. And we defeat those troops. And what's interesting is those French troops who had been kind of swearing loyalty to the Axis powers change sides and swear loyalty to the Allies. Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, was in charge of these troops and really kind of makes a name for himself as far as his leadership abilities. By May of 1943, just a few months later, the Afrika Korps, for the most part, surrender. And part of their surrender is the fact that even though they had great leadership and they had really well-trained troops, they didn't have a lot of supplies. A lot of the supplies that Adolf Hitler had for his military weren't making it to North Africa. They were either in ships that were in the Mediterranean that were sunk, or worse yet, those supplies never came because they were being diverted to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians, the Soviets. So Rommel flees, and about 250,000 or 250,000 Afrika Korps troops are actually taken or captured by the Allies, and many of those troops are sent to the United States to spend the remaining part of the war in prisoner of war camps. In July of 1943, the Allies invade the island of Sicily, where I'm moving my cursor right now, and within that month, within July of 43, Benito Mussolini is removed from power in Italy. By September of 43, Allied troops have made it to the Italian peninsula, primarily in the southern part. And at that point in time, Hitler sends more troops to replace the Italian troops that were, for the most part, surrendering to the Allies, to kind of hold firm here, to kind of support up the Axis powers. Let's talk a little bit about the Soviet Union. We had mentioned before that Adolf Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 during an event called Operation Barbarossa. During the winter of 1941 into 1942, there was a siege at the city of Leningrad, and roughly 3,000 to 4,000 civilians died each day due to starvation because Hitler pretty much had closed off the supply lines. In all, roughly 1 million Soviet citizens would perish in that event. So moving into the spring of 42, you know, the war is going to move a little bit to the south to the city of Stalingrad. And for the most part, Axis powers, they want to take the city. It's one of the largest cities in the Soviet Union, and it's a major industrial center. It's the center for shipping because it's near the Volga River. A lot of oil and grain come through here. And the siege at Stalingrad, in the end, this battle, is going to result in, again, over 1 million Soviet deaths. The Germans were forced eventually to retreat to the west by the end of this event. So in the end, when we talk about kind of towards the end of 1943, we've got, you know, kind of a change happening here. Our Soviets are kind of trying to stand firm to keep the Germans from going any further to the east. And by the end of 43, they're able to push back. The Axis powers are removed from North Africa. They're kind of making a run for it in the Italian peninsula. So the game is about to change. So thank you very much.